Hi guys, thanks for joining me in this broadcast. I've been talking a lot with different folks about this particular topic, and that I decided I was just going to go ahead and do a broadcast on it myself. One of my friends, a very intelligent guy, and that I always enjoy visiting with him, and he and I had a kind of a long exchange, or at least somewhat of a long exchange, on Facebook about this topic of was Charlie Kirk a Christian, a political martyr, or neither, or just a guy that got murdered? How do we think through all of this? And so I had a conversation with him. I'm in a number of Facebook groups, and I kind of lurk in most of them because I don't want to get engaged too much in that, believe it or not. But so I was but and that topic came up in a couple Facebook posts, and then I had a couple exchanges with some folks about Charlie Kirk, just as a man, and whether or not he was a man of a decent, noble character. And so I thought, hey, I might as well do a broadcast on this. So the big question that we're trying to answer here in this broadcast is that where does Charlie Kirk fit? Is he a Christian martyr, a political martyr, or what? And, it's I think a worthwhile question to explore. Some Christians are definitely political martyrs. And I'm just going to give it, like JFK, the benefit of the doubt that he was a Christian man, although I know that some people would dispute that regarding his character. But let's just give him the benefit of the doubt on that, and that I think that it would be pretty evident to argue that the reason why JFK was assassinated was not because of any of his religious views. Rather, it was entirely a political matter. That's why he was assassinated. So we can think of a lot of folks and ask the question about where they fit. Were they primarily political martyrs? Were they primarily Christian martyrs, or a combination of both, or neither, for that matter? So on the way to church the other day, my wife and I, it's about a 15-minute drive to church, and so we get into some interesting conversations on the way to church sometimes. And so I said, hey, I'm going to quiz you and to see how well you're doing, how well you do. And also maybe you can follow along in this yourself, because I'm old enough to remember a lot of these myself. But my question to my wife was just simply this, is that, do you remember their names? Do you remember their names of the assassin of these various folks, or the attempted, or the assassin who attempted to kill them? And I asked her, well, what about JFK? You remember that? And there's no problem that we had with that. How about RFK? And here again, that was pretty easy to remember. Then when it came to MLK, I was blanking out on that one, and I still remember that. I'm old enough to remember where I was when all of these, or at least I remember all of these. My wife said the other day, she was talking about her dad. She said, I was so amazed. When I was growing up, I was amazed at how much my dad knew of history. And then she says, it dawned on me that he lived through most of what I was asking him about. And that's the same, as you get older, you have that benefit of hindsight. And but I remember the benefit of hindsight, but you lose your foresight somewhat, But I remember all of these assassinations or attempted assassinations of these various people, and so we went through and looked it up on AI, some of their names. I said, "How about John Lennon? Do you remember his assassin?" Then we went through and we were guessing the ages of these various folks when either attempts were made on their lives or that they had lost their lives. And it's really interesting, I mean, JFK, RFK, MLK, John Lennon were all in their 40s when they died. So, I said, how about Gerald Ford? Do you remember the lady who attempted to assassinate him? You might want to just kind of put in your and see how well you do. You can put in the comments the name of the person, the name of the public figure, and then the name of the assassin. But without cheating, without going to any of your AI resources. And then I said, how about Reagan's attempted assassin? I still remember that one very vividly, and maybe it's one of the reasons why it's been played over so many times on television. And then I said, well, how about the guy who attempted the assassination on Donald Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania? And for the life of me, I could not remember the name of that guy. And even though that's the most recent one. And so you can see how well you do, and just, out of curiosity on thinking through some of these things. But going back to the original question, is that some Christians are definitely religious martyrs. I think, the church leader Stephen, who is considered to be the very first Christian martyr, who was murdered by the High Council of the Jewish nation, is that he was definitely murdered for his religious beliefs. Then, I was also thinking about Jim Elliot, and let me see if I can remember. I looked it up on the web on how to pronounce the name of that tribe, and I think it's Wirrani, if I remember right. Although the 3 different sites that I went to check on the pronunciation of that name all gave me different pronunciations. So much for that. But certainly I think that Stephen and also Jim Elliot. And Jim Elliot was a guy, I don't remember exactly when, it was either in the 50s or 60s, who went to an unreached people group in Ecuador to share the gospel of Christ with them. And he and his team, they flew in, and at least one time, maybe, and I know at least 2 times, and maybe it was on the second time that they were all murdered there on the beach of that island in Ecuador. So, some people, however, are both Christian and political martyrs. Bonhoeffer, he's an interesting character. He is a very devout Christian who lived during Hitler's era in Nazi Germany. He, if I remember, and I haven't read his history. I know that, I know of the books about his life, but I haven't really explored that much further than just knowing some of the vague contours of his story. But if I remember right, he had the opportunity to find sanctuary in America, but he chose to return to Germany. And as a Christian, which is an interesting, this is all very interesting, but as a Christian, is that he participated in plotting the assassination of Adolf Hitler. And I think that he attempted it on one time that failed. I at least saw a movie. I think Tom Cruise was in it, and that then just a couple weeks before Hitler was defeated, Bonhoeffer was arrested, tried, and hanged for his attempt on Hitler's life. Nathan Hale was an early figure in the American Revolution, and he was decidedly Christian, and he's the guy that said, and I got him confused with Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry is not the guy. It's Nathan Hale who said, "Give me liberty or give me death," and he was hanged by the British in actually when I think he was 22 years old. The interesting thing is that Nathan Hale, just like Bonhoeffer, is that what propelled them into their political activism was their religious convictions, and particularly their Christian religious convictions. And so I think that it's fair to say that both Bonhoeffer and Nathan Hale were Christians who were both martyrs. They were Christian martyrs as well as political martyrs. So I kind of give them, at least I mark them to the right of our little Venn diagram here. That and so it's they kind of incline a little bit more to the political spectrum, but that doesn't mean that their decisions. That doesn't mean that their decisions were only politically motivated. That they had thought through the religious implications of their political actions. That's an important concept to kind of hang on to there, is that they thought through the political implications of their Christian commitment. So as we go on, as we're exploring this question of where does Charlie Kirk fit in this, is that we could ask, what about the Apostle Paul? Where does he fit in all of this? Paul was, here's a little interesting aside. Paul, before he became a Christian, was the leading Jewish authority who gave consent to Stephen's death, the first Christian martyr. It was Paul who gave consent to Jesus' death. Later on in the narrative, the Apostle Paul himself becomes a Christian, and he actually becomes one of the most, if I would think it's fair to say he's probably the most significant Christian leader to help promote the Christian faith throughout the world. And he spent his whole, the rest of his life going to various places throughout the Roman Empire, preaching the gospel, being horribly persecuted and abused along the way. You can read the stories of that if you're not familiar with Paul's life, and it's found in the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostle. And particularly, it kind of picks up in chapter 9. Then there's a couple kind of asides, a couple intervening chapters. And then I think, if I remember right, it's chapter 12, that where we get Paul starts off with Barnabas on some of these missionary tours, and so and ultimately Paul was arrested and taken to Rome, actually on two separate occasions, and then on the last his last Roman imprisonment, he was actually beheaded by Nero during that Roman imprisonment. Where would you fit the Apostle Paul? That what would how would you classify him? A Christian martyr, or a political martyr, or both? That I tend to kind of place Paul to the left of center on our Venn diagram here, and I think I would assign him to that position, because, and it's interesting when you stop and think about it, is that when Paul would go to the various places he would go to sharing Christ, that oftentimes the pushback that he received both from Jews and non-Jews, Gentiles, is that that he was advocating customs that are not appropriate for us to follow. And of course, I believe it was also the economic impact in some of these cases. And so, in one case, Paul was preaching to some folks, and and he was preaching against their idol worship. Well, some of the silversmiths in the town found that pretty offensive, and so he was persecuted for that. There were political implications for Paul's Christian commitment. So some people are both, and here's an interesting question: what about Jesus Christ? Now, obviously, Jesus was not a Christian. Jesus was Jewish, and that he had followed the teachings of the Jewish faith. He is the founder of the Christian religion, and that's why we call ourselves Christians. It means followers of the Christ, and we are disciples of Christ. And so, but how about Jesus? Why was he killed? And I think you could make a pretty solid argument, at least I would. I would make a pretty solid argument that Jesus, like Paul, was killed both for his religious commitments, but also his political stances. Because Jesus' message was very much offensive to the institutions of power in his generation, particularly the Jewish institutions of power, Judaism, or Judah was an occupied country, as was all of Palestine during the life of Jesus. The Romans occupied it. And so Jesus took on the Jewish authorities time and time again, and he wasn't very polite with them, by the way. But also it was the collusion between the Jewish authorities and Pilate, the Roman authority, that ultimately ended up with Jesus being crucified. And so I think it's really fair to say that Jesus, it was both a religious and political martyr. So we still, of course, haven't answered the question, is that, well, what about Charlie Kirk? I have watched enough videos of Charlie Kirk and his presentations. Whether or not you like the guy, he had an encyclopedic knowledge of his subject. And he also was an extremely gifted debater or conversationalist. But when you peek under the hood, and time again, what we see is Charlie Kirk, by his own testimony, that he he believed wholeheartedly in Jesus as being both Lord and Christ, and that he believed what we would consider to be traditional or orthodox Christian teachings with regard to the triune nature of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the substitutionary atonement that Jesus' life would redeem humanity, and of course the resurrection, the literal and bodily resurrection from the dead, and the actual miracles. And Charlie Kirk believed all of these things about Jesus. I heard him speak enough to kind of be able to weigh out his teachings on those things. You know, interestingly enough, is that my wife sent me a reel today about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You know, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had a profound impact on my life, both with respect to his teachings about civil rights, and also with respect to his policy of nonviolent protesting. But the thing that really impacted me probably most in my thinking with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Was his understanding of natural law theory. Now, if you're not familiar with natural law theory, it's a legal. It's actually a philosophical theory. Is that we as humans we share essentially certain instinctual or certain basic or certain natural values. And that's why, you know, people always say, you know, that cultures are so different. And C.S. Lewis made a very clear distinction of that, because you travel the world and you do not find cultures where murder is celebrated, or cowardice is celebrated, or some of these are infidelity is celebrated. Instead, what you find is that people are the same. And I've traveled enough of the world, and not even in Christian contexts, to know that people are the same wherever you go, and that we have this instinctual or natural law sense of what's right and wrong, and how life basically should operate. You know, this whole concept of what's fair and what's just. So in his letter from Birmingham jail, on one occasion when Dr. Martin Luther King was imprisoned or jailed, is that he wrote out his thoughts about his movement. And it's interesting because he cites natural law theory with respect to when civil disobedience is not just permissible but required. And the two main thinkers that he cites on that is Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine. I would encourage you to read those sections. They're just really profound. And furthermore, Dr. Martin Luther King was a towering intellect. No question about it. And he's really a pleasure to read his writing. He was a very gifted man. But getting back to this question that we're considering, is that talking about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., his Christian faith was not in any sense a traditional Christian faith. He denied the Trinity. He denied the substitutionary. And these are according, I looked this up. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't just kind of blowing smoke here when I was talking. But I looked this up before I jumped into this tonight, and that and so I did an AI search on it. It says, in summary, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did not subscribe to Orthodox Christian beliefs concerning the Trinity, the divinity of Christ, substitutionary atonement. So in other words, Jesus gave his life for us so that we can be reconciled to God. The virgin birth, literal miracles, or biblical inerrancy. He held a progressive experiential Christian faith focused on the moral and personal nature of God and the ethical imperatives of love and justice. But Dr. King, in his own writings, would not be considered to be a traditional Orthodox. He would not be considered to have traditional or Orthodox Christian beliefs. Now, I know from what I've how I've watched Charlie Kirk in his various presentations, I know where he stood on those matters, and I know that his Christian beliefs were traditional and Orthodox. And then when it comes to character, and once again, I thought, okay, I just want to make sure before I talk, before I make a truth claim, I want to make sure, before I make any assertion, I want to make sure that I have the evidence to back it up. And when it comes to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s moral character, that we find out that he, let me just read it here again. This is from, it says, I asked the question, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is alleged to have had a number of moral failures, particularly with women. Are any of these allegations considered to be fact? This AI says, the short answer is yes. Multiple reputable investigations and primary source documents support that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had extramarital and sexual relationships and engaged in conduct that most would consider moral failures. While some details reported in popular accounts remain disputed, the core allegation that Dr. King had multiple sexual affairs is supported by strong documentary evidence. This is interesting to me. And the reason why it's interesting to me is because this whole issue of character has come up time and time again with respect to Charlie Kirk and some of my Facebook friends who are a little bit more, or maybe who are a lot more left-leaning than me, and that they've made these allegations and about Charlie Kirk. I would hate to be, I'm just telling you this, is that I would hate to be the type of person who had that as much high-level visibility as Charlie Kirk, and then people scrutinizing my life and character at every turn, while I consider myself to have lived a good Christian life. There have been times when I'm driving, or things I've said to my family or friends, or me losing my temper, or me turning my head to check out somebody that, I think that probably most of us would not want to have that much scrutiny in our lives when it comes to our moral character. But if you're going to point the finger at Charlie Kirk, then you should also disregard and discount Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., because Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s moral failings are, at this stage in the game, as far as I can tell, much more egregious than Charlie Kirk's, and much more highly documented than any allegations against Charlie Kirk. So when it comes to his moral character, I don't always agree with how, I've watched enough of the debates. I don't always agree with how Charlie Kirk came off with some of the people that he was talking to. But, I'll tell you one thing, he does it a whole lot better than I could. And actually even factually sometimes when I'm looking at Charlie Kirk's some of the statements that he made, and particularly on some of his Christian apologetic stuff, because I do consider myself somewhat of an expert in that area. Then I said, no, not quite, Charlie. You on that one, you tossed the ball up and it bounced off the rim, But hey, at least he was out there tossing the ball up. So when it comes to his message, that's interesting, because Charlie Kirk's message was informed by his Christian commitments, just like Dietrich Bonhoeffer's message was informed by his Christian commitments, and Nathan Hale, his message was informed by his Christian, and his actions were informed by his Christian commitments. And the same with Charlie Kirk. Now, does that mean that he got every issue correct? I would offer you this, is that if you think he was off target, then share the reasons why you think he was off target on a particular subject, instead of these ad hominem attacks that his are lodged against him in his memory, and since he's died, that he's racist. That's the go-to one. Here it is. He was a racist. He was a bigot. These are all ad hominem attacks. He's a racist, a bigot, or he was a hater. And if we can believe, and I think it's sufficient to think so, that the young man who assassinated Charlie Kirk killed him because he thought he was full of hate. Charlie Kirk. How ironic. The murderer thought that Charlie Kirk was full of hate. So when it comes to his methods, that I really respect Charlie Kirk's approach. He had reasoned out his convictions, his message, and he communicated them in what I've seen a largely respectful way to the public constantly. And so if I had to vote and answer the question, was Charlie Kirk a Christian, a political martyr, or both, I would tend to cast my ballot that he was right there, the same place that we find other remarkable Christian people throughout history. Nathan Hale, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, amongst others, Jan Hus and different ones. That's where he lands, at least in my vote. So, and obviously you got to just sort this thing out for yourself. But I would invite you to, instead of make baseless accusations about Charlie Kirk, And instead of just calling him names, that think it through and make your case. And let's see what evidence that you can present. Hey, I appreciate you taking some time to spend with me and to think about this topic. And so